Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Today, our guest is Chris Haufe, author of Fruitfulness, Science, Metaphor, and the Puzzle of Promise. It's published by the Oxford University Press as part of their excellent series, Studies in the Philosophy of Science, which is a concept we can't discuss because in some ways, at least to me as a layman, philosophy and science seem to be almost oxymoronic. It'll be released in late May. Chris works on problems in the history and philosophy of knowledge across a variety of disciplines. He's been at Case Western for the past 15 years or so, and his current projects relate to the role of metaphor in science, which we'll discuss, the conceptual and historical foundations of scientism, and the epistemology, which we'll talk a lot about, of the humanities. His previous works include Do the Humanities Create Knowledge and How Knowledge Grows. So some ideas tend to, for whatever reason, disproportionately lead to new insights, discoveries, ideas, and actually paradigm shifts, the concept first postulated by Kuhn in his seminal work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, revolutions versus ordinary science, and thus fruitful, and as we'll discuss, also perhaps apt. So Chris explores this concept as well as its correlates, and as the subtitle states, metaphor and a kind of, to me, an almost evanescent puzzle of promise. Epistemology and its variants figure constantly throughout this work. The theory of science, our mind as it relates to the reality that we perceive. Do we know stuff? And how and when do we know these things? And for those of my listeners who frequent this podcast, you're well aware that through my conversations with David Chalmers and Philip Goff and Donald Hoffman and scores of others, this is what I have been searching for. I guess my personal quest is an answer to this question, and I still haven't gotten one. It always just seems to go back to Descartes. So let's see if we can get further today. So welcome, Chris, and thanks for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
So as a bookseller, it's not true that you can't judge a book by its cover, because everyone who comes into my bookstore judges the book by its cover, unless they know specifically what book they want. So this cover is really ripe, no pun intended, for conversation because it's called Fruitfulness, and subtitle is Science, Metaphor, and the Puzzle of Promise. And then it has 6 really beautifully rendered figs of different species. And so I wondered if we could talk a little bit about, and as we discussed before we began, the concept of fruitfulness, because to most people, they think obviously of fruit-bearing trees, or they think of the Christian or the religious definition of fruitfulness, starting with be fruitful and multiply. And, there's fruitful, which goes to the seed. There's fruitfulness, which goes perhaps to the object of the fruit itself. So how does someone who comes into the bookstore, looks at the title, how would you like them to relate to that title?
Well, yeah, okay. I think the metaphor of a fruit itself is a good place to start, right? That those figs came from a tree that came from a single seed, right? And in some form, all that stuff, the leaves, the figs, the tree, were contained in that seed. The rudiments out of which those things grow are contained in the seed. And, researchers in the sciences and mathematics, they're constantly looking for a seed that can kind of keep fruiting, right? Keep producing new lines of inquiry, new discoveries, or, new opportunities for them to follow up, new branches of inquiry, right? There's a lot of, it's called fruitfulness for a reason, in other words, right? It really, does follow a lot of the kind of literal features, that we would associate with the growth of literal fruit. And I think that it's just been, this is a feature of research frameworks and theories that is always, you always hear researchers mention it, praise a theory for its fruitfulness and so on. And it just has not really been investigated as its own thing before. And so that's kind of what I wanted to look into.
Well, if we probe further, and it's easy to do, your subtitle leads us to the next. I always look at every scientific or philosophical book that I've interviewed has a subtitle, and there's a reason for it. It's like the outside of the book is almost like the cover of a jigsaw puzzle box. There's the entire picture, and it's the
Mhm.
pieces inside that you have to put together. And so when you say science, metaphor, and the puzzle of promise, those are three questions that they're questions. And if I go back to say, if we start with metaphor, for example, because I find that pretty much everything in science is metaphor.
Mm.
And if you go back to Douglas Hofstadter, that's essentially, whether it's metamagical themas or Gödel, Escher, Bach, the whole book, and he admits it and then continues to admit it in his subsequent works, is metaphor. Why is it then? Well, first of all, why is it part of your subtitle? And second of all, why is it that whether you're a layperson or not, metaphor is the best and sometimes perhaps the only way that you can have comprehension or epistemological understanding of either a concept or a theorem?
Okay. Well, yeah, so it's part of my subtitle because it ends up um, providing a lot of what we need for a solution to what I call the puzzle of promise. Um, and as far as why it's so sort of ubiquitous or kind of essential to science, I mean, it's as a language speaker, it's impossible to escape the use of metaphor. There's no such thing as like an inherently literal statement, right? We come up with names for things and ways of describing things that make sense to us. And in science, we sort of progressively refine those means of describing things using criteria that are intuitive but also particular to science, like accuracy and experimental validity and stuff like that. Right, but what we're refining, I think, is a description that we started off with that helped us do the kinds of things we want to do in science. And the more developed it becomes, the more ubiquitous it becomes across a discipline, the more it starts to transform into a literal statement. But it begins as a metaphor. There's just no way around that. I mean, especially given the fact that a lot of times you aren't looking directly at what you're studying, right? You're looking at kind of symptoms of what you're studying and trying to put a name on the thing that is producing those effects. And, so, I mean, there's, especially, if you're studying like a novel phenomenon or something, right? And something that's never been seen before. I mean, is there an inherently correct name for that thing? No, it's you label it what it seems most appropriate to label it. And it's kind of associations, conceptual associations sort of unfurl from a lot of them anyway, unfurl from that initial choice to label it this or that.
Well, what's the difference then between that metaphor, which essentially is explicatory because there's no literal way of framing it, And the kind of gross metaphors, say you're trying to explain Einstein's relativity. So you talk about two observers on a train, or you talk about an astronaut who comes back and his granddaughter's hundreds of years older than he is, or the discounted view of the atom as a solar system, as opposed to a quantum definition. What's the difference between that kind of metaphor, if there's a difference, and those explaining metaphors?
Yeah. Okay. No, that's a good question. I think that what we find in science is, the theories that are in use, or the metaphors that are in use, are ones that have emerged, have resonated with practitioners as being particularly apt for what they're studying. Say, and by apt, I mean they're accurate. They're as accurate as science needs them to be, or as the field needs them to be. They give the kind of salient or important properties of the phenomenon they're studying. They give them the proper attention, right? The attention that they think that members of the scientific community think really matter. Attention to the kinds of things that members of the community think really matter, and they sort of offer further opportunities. They suggest further directions for inquiry. They kind of inherently raise further questions that scientists can pursue. I think that what separates, to your question, what separates the metaphors that scientists that are like currently in use in a given discipline from the ones that maybe we use to teach with, or we use to present in a popular setting, are that the metaphors that are widely in use in a field have qualities that scientists need that kind of satisfy the criteria for doing science, right? A metaphor that helps you do science itself needn't be the same as a metaphor that helps a layperson like me sort of understand what is going on in that science, right?
Well, that was something I said in the introduction, is like, okay, there's science in which, and I just interviewed a guy who wrote a book called Beautiful Experiments. There's the science itself, where you come up with a hypothesis. If the technology is available, you experiment. And as in Einstein's case, the technology wasn't available, and every time it becomes available, he's validated. So why and where is the position of a philosopher who's examining science, when, as I said in the introduction, it almost seems like the two just can't possibly go together? Because epistemology, which the word and its variants is mentioned like 22 times in the first 3 pages of your book.
Okay.
And I'm thinking, okay, I understand it. Does this become tautological? Is our search for knowledge essentially simply the search for knowledge, and we're going to be talking about the search for knowledge until we get somewhere, whereas the scientist is actually positing something that he then proves is what's considered to be a fact, a scientific fact. So what are you saying to him or about him or her?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I guess I'm, as a philosopher, I am really interested in the quality, the nature of scientific knowledge. What state do we enter when we claim to have scientific knowledge of this or that? And when I teach the book Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which you mentioned a lot. I probably teach it once a year, and so I think over the course of several years of reading it, I really came to sort of appreciate the depth of a particular challenge to the rationality of scientific knowledge, which was that scientists, and this is one of the things that most interested Thomas Kuhn, the author of Structure. Communities of scientists throughout history seem to very rapidly and without what we would traditionally regard as scientific evidence, right, adopt a whole new framework for conducting research. They use it to guide their research. They use it to guide their thinking about what they're seeing. And it doesn't, those frameworks are not adopted through kind of traditional means, the kind of thing you described as experimental validation, right? Or large scale, research programs funded by, massive grants from the government or something, right? It's like something that occurs to a community, kind of all at once. They sort of see it and they immediately adopt it. And that framework through that process ends up kind of governing the next, several generations of scientific inquiry. Sometimes, in the case of Newtonian theory, hundreds of years. In the case of Aristotelian theory, which is not a modern scientific theory, but it was productively used by, people we'd call scientists, almost 2,000 years. So what I wanted to understand is, how can we regard these decisions to adopt, or these events in which scientific communities quickly adopt these frameworks and govern themselves through them in a way that explains how they are rational, right? Explains how they are part of the kind of paradigmatic rationality that we associate with scientific knowledge. So, to me, that was a puzzle that just really gripped me. It's not something that a scientist would normally concern themselves with, right? They're sort of busy studying nature itself. I'm interested in studying science, and in particular, the rationality of the decision-making procedures, or the rationality of kind of the transitions under which scientific communities frequently go.
If you go back to Aristotelian, or say Platonic ideals, if you go back to the Greeks, and okay, you could say that what Aristotle did was fruitful, but is it the propagation of those ideas over thousands of years that is fruitfulness? And as scientists love to say, they love failure. Elon Musk, fail fast, succeed fast. And so what was once accepted, because posited by whoever it was, whether it was Archimedes or not, is all those thousands of years, and I'm not articulating it properly, but is it all that thousands of years propagation of, and including, fruitfulness?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the way I think about it, right? That it's a fruitfulness is kind of a capacity that carries a theory through several different generations of scientists. I mean, the people, the community in which Aristotelian philosophy and natural science, natural philosophy was born, I mean, is just a very different place from early modern Europe, right? But people were still using the Aristotelian framework in some form very productively. I mean, it turned out to be kind of the twilight of that framework. But the writing the writing that comes out of the, Aristotelians or scholastics of that period is taken very seriously. It's very systematic. It's explanatory, within its own kind of domain, its own framework. But, you get to appreciate when you look at how long this framework has endured for, and kind of the adaptability of this framework to the different goals of many different communities and cultures. You gain a whole new respect for it, right? And you start to see why I think scientists will really go to the mat over the fruitfulness of a theory. That something like the truth of a theory, a lot less valuable, a lot less interesting, right? A fruitful theory, even one that's not, that is not true, can be, and I think generally is, much more valuable than just kind of like an inert truth. I mean, the generativity of failure is a good example, the one that you mentioned, right? I think I mentioned this a little bit in the book, in reference to Henri Poincaré, who was a mathematician and a physicist from the sort of late 19th, early 20th century. He himself is completely open about the fact that what they as physicists really want is a theory that fails. They want an experiment that goes wrong, because that gives them something that they know they need to understand. Right.
It's really interesting, and I've spoken with other people about this too. My hero, Richard Feynman, he talks about, a scientist comes up with this beautiful hypothesis, which goes to the beautiful experiment. But when they conduct the experiment, it's a little bit off. It doesn't quite work. So the scientist tweaks this way and tweaks it a little bit until everything fits. And then Feynman says, there's no reason to talk to this guy anymore.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, no, yeah, he's a hero of mine too. Yeah. I mean, that's absolutely, I think, I was in a colloquium, a physics colloquium, a few years ago, right after the LIGO experiment detected gravitational waves. And in the Q&A, I sort of asked, why do you guys keep testing this theory? How many, this one cost $2 billion. Like, how many billions of dollars are we going to spend on testing this theory? And, the kind of cosmologist, astronomer in the room stood up, and he just kind of was like, we don't care about the truth of Einstein's theory, right? That's not really what interests us in this, that's not what interests us about this experiment. What interests us is what it tells us about what we're going to now know we'll be able to do, what we'll be able to look at. It opens up a whole new field of inquiry. I mean, that to me is just so interesting, because, if you read, Above the Fold on the New York Times, the day that result came out, what's the headline? Einstein's theory passes, confirms Einstein's theory, or whatever, right? So that's, I think the popular conception, the popular epistemology of science would naturally, and the one that is kind of, I think, dominant among philosophers of science, would naturally see the value of that as being, confirming Einstein's theory. But that's just not how practitioners see it. And I wanted to write something that gave people a sense of, looking at science through the lens of the way that practitioners talk about what interests them, right? And what they find valuable in a theory. So, it's a lot of conversations with scientists, reading history of science, just trying to develop kind of a model, like a psychological model of the scientist in a research context.
Well, isn't there still like, don't they have this kind of feeling that they're still standing on the shoulders of giants, which is kind of like fruitfulness?
Oh
Do they?
yeah, yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, I think, the people tend to see, or they think of science as ahistorical. Certainly scientists themselves, um, I think, are not overwhelmingly interested in the history of their science, as say written in a history book or something. I mean, a lot of them are, and I've learned a lot about the history of particular disciplines from practitioners. But I think what a lot of people sort of fail to appreciate is, when you start off in science, as a student or a graduate student, um, you are standing on a platform that's been developed over hundreds of years, some equations, 1,000 years, 1,500 years. Um, it's a deeply historical endeavor. It could not exist without reference to history. It's just kind of history that is presented, in a more abstract form, right? They've sort of titrated what they need out of the history over successive generations. But yeah, I mean, a science that, I mean, the philosopher Whitehead had this beautiful quote. He said, "A science who fails to forget its history is lost." Um, and I understand what he means by that. And it's no accident that say science textbooks are deeply ahistorical. But it's also worth appreciating that the science that is being learned or used at any given time is a product of history, right? It's a product of the development of a field of inquiry that can go back, many generations. It would be impossible to do it without history.
It sounds like Nietzsche. It's like you need to forget everything in order to do anything. Then it goes to nihilism. Shit. Anyway, so back to your book. So I was thinking, as a bookseller, again, one of the things that propels people to turn pages is humor. So even if it's other people might consider, okay, this is dry, even early on in the book, when you talk about drawing within the lines,
Yeah.
kind of use an expletive, which I can't believe you just said that. And so and that goes back to Kuhn to a certain extent too. So what is it? What are the pros and cons? I mean, you say you draw within, you said you draw within the lines. And at the same time, I like to draw outside the lines. Am I better than you? Are you better than me? What are the pros and cons here? And is that what creates the paradigm shift?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think I don't know. You just have to go with your gut, I think, whatever feels right. As a writer, I mean, this is, I'm in that part, I'm sort of talking about how much vitality does the dominant philosophy of science have left in it. And I generally like working within a well-established framework because it's much easier to communicate with people. The problems and the importance of the problems is already very clear. The kind of shape of the problems themselves uh, is already very clear. But I think that in the philosophy of science, I just started to feel like we're just playing the wrong game. and we need to kind of break out of the mold that we're in of thinking of science as a truth producing, truth oriented endeavor. Not that it doesn't do those things, right? But that from the perspective of the practitioner, there's a lot that you simply can't understand why science develops in the way that it does if you are fixated on how do we know when scientific theories are true.
Yeah, but okay, going back to Nietzsche, the outsider, the Ubermensch, whatever you want to say, we talked before a little bit about your kids and giving them advice. And so suppose one of your children gets a note sent home from the teacher, Tommy needs to learn to draw within the lines. What are you going to say? Don't don't listen to her, Tommy. You do what you want to do. What are you going to say? You're going to say you need to, what are you going to say?
It's a tough one. Gosh, I was not prepared for these gotcha questions.
That's why I do this show.
Yeah, I guess I would tell them to color within the lines, unless there was a overriding, compelling reason to go outside the lines.
Because they want to, because that's where curiosity leads them. That's
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate curiosity. I think that it's most productive in a well-defined framework, right?
they don't want to be in a well-defined framework. That's why
Oh,
Elon Musk and Steve Jobs, that's why Steve Jobs parked in handicap spots.
did he really?
He only parked in handicap spots and he never had a license plate on his car because in California, you can drive for 6 months without a license plate. So he leased his car for 6 months.
Interesting. Um,
But
yeah,
it's the outliers that make the dents in the universe. So if everyone drew within the lines would always be the same lines.
yeah. I mean, so I guess I follow the great Thomas Kuhn in this
Right.
right, which is that most progress comes from staying in the lines, and if you absolutely can't stay in the lines, then definitely don't. At some point, you have to stop. Um, but what in any case, what accounts for the great progress of science, on his view, is the kind of like addiction to staying within the lines. I mean, it's more than that, right? It's like you can't even see that there are lines to stay into, right? You just think this is how things are, right? This is the world. You're not aware of a space outside of the lines. Um, and the breakthroughs come as people start pushing up against the lines and realize that there's stuff they want to do. There's questions they want answered, that there's no space left within the lines to answer them.
Yeah, and that's the reason why I keep going back to Nietzsche is I'm interviewing this guy tomorrow, Richard Schacht, who keeps writing these books about Nietzsche. And this guy was outside, he was off the sheet of paper. And Schacht says, in the 60s, no one listened to Nietzsche. There wasn't anyone interested in him. He was laughed at. And then as time went by, people started listening to him. And now, he's everywhere from Jordan Peterson to whoever. And
Yeah.
yeah, and I don't know. I never drew within the lines, but I don't know whether that was, I honestly don't know whether that was good or bad. But that also brings me to something that's personal to you, but that, especially when I was listening to you talk in your interviews, is that you wouldn't have started any of this stuff if it wasn't for Rage Against the Machine.
That is true. Yeah.
So that's kind of completely out. Tell us what that's about, because that's really cool.
The Rage Against the Machine moment. Yeah, okay. It was June 15th, 1996. I was sitting at the intersection of Tittabawassee and Mackinac in my hometown of Saginaw, Michigan. And I heard this song, and I was like, oh my God, I've never heard anything like this. This is incredible. And it turned out to be, it was, somebody had just given me a mixtape, and it turned out to be a song by Rage Against the Machine. So, I got a hold of a Rage Against the Machine album that had come out a couple months earlier. The liner notes, for some of your listeners may not be aware of what liner notes are. There was kind of like, a fold in a tape or a CD that you could, it was like kind of a folio. You take it out, and it had information about the band and stuff. Well, they had pictures, some cool pictures. They had taken a picture of a bunch of books and kind of like laid out in a nice pattern. And there was a book in there by Noam Chomsky, Necessary Illusions. And so I went to the local university library, and I checked out a copy of this book. And it was way too hard for me to understand. So I went to Barnes and Noble, and I bought a much slimmer, like more accessible volume by Chomsky called The Prosperous Few and the Restless Many. And it just completely opened my world. I mean, I had no idea like what was going on, in terms of global affairs, what the, United States role was in some of these kind of, mid to late 20th century machinations in Latin America and so forth. And it just, I mean, it was like a total meltdown in my worldview. And yeah, I mean, it sort of set me on the path. It just put me outside
The
the line.
lines.
Yeah. Yeah. I just could not look at.
You were perforce placed outside of the lines.
Yes, dragged outside.
And that's why we're talking today. This is why your life is, it's so weird, isn't it?
It is. It really is. It all goes back to rage.
And the thing that pisses me off about you is, since I listened to that interview, I get in the car and I go, "Hey Siri, play Rage Against the Machine," and I got to stop
Lucky
doing
you.
it. It's been
Yeah.
2 days in a row.
All right. There you go. See?
Okay, Siri I said Siri and she just answered.
What's she playing?
She's Take the Power Back.
It's a great song. Yeah.
That's really
Track
weird.
3. Yeah.
That is so weird. There's some fruitfulness for you.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so Noam Chomsky, what's the connection between Noam Chomsky and fruitfulness?
I mean, I think the whole reason I went into philosophy was because I was just enamored of Chomsky. I really wanted to do what he did. This was before I knew anything about linguistics. And I mean, I think I've just been sort of on that path that Chomsky started me off on, exploring different avenues on it. I did contact him in reference to this book a few years back. While I was writing, I was in Cambridge, and I was like, I'm looking at the kind of foundations of how the emergence of new disciplines, and your linguistics, seems just like a really good case for me to look at, and I just wanted to come talk to you about it. But we couldn't, our schedules didn't match up, so I didn't get the chance. But I mean, there's a lot there. The emergence of Chomsky and linguistics, sort of in the 60s, is a really nice illustration of the kind of process I describe in the book, right? I mean, there's some, there's a limited number of really interesting results, empirical results that come out of the very early, kind of late 50s work on syntax. But most of what, I think attracted researchers to it was the simple fact that it was very clear, easy to use, and people could sort of really see where it could, where it was going to go, or where they could take it in any case, right? It just became a very, very useful tool.
What's the difference between empiricism and epistemology?
Well, empiricism is a brand of epistemology, right? I mean, in philosophy, we talk about empiricism as kind of a a philosophical view that holds that all knowledge is rooted in empirical. All knowledge is fundamentally empirical, right? There's no a priori knowledge, right? Or there's no knowledge that you could acquire without investigating the world.
Well, then we go back to, I'm stuck going back to Descartes then.
Right. So
what do I need all you
not
guys?
an empiricist, yeah.
Yeah, what do I need all you guys if it still goes back to this duality thing?
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah, so
you're non-falsifiable. Everything you do is non-falsifiable.
well, Descartes, right, he would represent kind of the other pole of epistemology, right? The arch rationalist. That there's a lot that you could know just by thinking. I mean, as much I'm not a I guess I incline much more toward empiricism than Descartes. But I was, when I first read that, Chomsky led me to Descartes, actually. That was really what got me into philosophy proper. When I read the Meditations, I remember like coming downstairs and telling my parents, like, I'm going to be a philosopher. Like, this is what I want to do with my life. Like,
What did they say?
they were like, okay. I mean, they, to their credit, they never raised an eyebrow about, what are you going to do with that? Are you going to, what kind of job are you going to get with that? It was just like, okay, that's what he's studying, whatever. So I mean, as a parent of a college student myself, I can't say I'd be that tolerant of a crazy plan like studying philosophy. But I think that I really am grateful to them for just sort of letting me follow this impulse.
Isn't it interesting how, like with the Rage Against the Machine moment or walking down the stairs moment, that you can remember, I do this too, exactly where you were. You remember the date. I do that
Yeah.
too. Why? Why do we do that?
It's just, I mean, it's just so deeply ingrained. I mean, it's just such a momentous shift,
You can remember, I do the same thing. You can remember the intersections of the streets.
It's a big moment for me, man.
Really strange. It's really cool. Hey, let me play devil's advocate for a moment. So like some readers might look at this as like, well, he's just putting a gloss on something, or this is just a commentary about something. He's talking about a community that he's either inside of. Well, actually, that's a good way of putting it. Are you inside this community? Or are you outside this community you're talking about?
I'm firmly outside. Yeah, I don't do any science. I don't pretend to do any science. I mean, I'm community adjacent, I say, or I guess I spend a lot of time talking to scientists, collaborating with them on, teaching or stuff that's not scientific research per se, but is still, scholarly. So, some of my best friends are scientists. But yeah, I'm not
I don't think that's politically correct.
I'm not I'm definitely not part of the scientific community. I just, I have a set of questions that I like probing them and their experience. Uh, and I've learned a lot about science from that. And I've learned, the picture that I get from talking to them and from reading the history of science is very different from the picture that I get from reading the philosophy of science, or reading kind of popular accounts of science or science in the media, or textbook science. And I wanted to generate a picture, an alternative picture of science, as I've come to see it through the history of science and through my relationships with practitioners.
Do you remember that? I think it was the Nova special with Feynman, where he's talking about his friend, the poet, who says, it's so much easier for me to describe the beauty of a flower than a scientist. And then Feynman goes off, no, I see this. I see why color attracts. I see so many other things about the flower than you can see, that I see way more beauty in the flower than you could ever imagine.
Mm. Yeah, I do remember something like that. I haven't seen that special, but I remember he talks about it in one of his books, maybe.
Yeah, so I guess that's what I'm saying might be a reader's conclusion, not mine, that the scientists actually perform the work that you're observing from the outside, because there's no Venn diagram that puts you in with them anywhere, because you're not even suburban. You're an adjacent community, but you're not suburban. So how would you rebut if I specifically say, okay, the scientist is actually doing the work, the results are his, and you are then doing what to that science? You're not doing anything to that science. You're telling me something about that science.
Right. Yeah. I'm trying to give an honest account of how that work gets done and how scientific knowledge gets built and how discoveries are made, and how directions of research are chosen, how views of the world ultimately develop. That I think that these are, most of what I have come to see, I think, um, resonates with scientists. It's, a lot of time when I'm talking to people, they'll say, yeah, that's true. I've never heard it put into words, right? They're busy actually studying nature, right? Not reflecting on and articulating their experience.
Right.
That's what we as philosophers, humanists do. We are interested in articulating the kind of suppressed or tacit content of human experience, the deep features that might, even, might be subconscious, but are nevertheless, really important, have major effects on the direction of human culture, human civilization. And this is kind of the corner that I've chosen to develop articulations of, right? What is in a scientist's mind or a mathematician's mind when they're choosing, um, a view about what the world is like or what numbers are fundamentally like or something.
This is kind of meta, but I was thinking when I was reading the book, I was thinking, you know what? He's talking about metaphor, but the book itself might actually be a metaphor, because you can apply as a template what you do with science to lots of other things.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, do you have anything in mind in particular?
Well, that's why I started. Now it's kind of circular, because kept starting to think of Nietzsche, and then I was thinking, well, I would then be applying to a philosopher, what a philosopher is saying about scientists.
Yeah, I mean, philosophy definitely works in this way. I mean, you know, the reason it's not a puzzle in philosophy is generally because people are not uh, in the accustomed to thinking that the way that philosophers, adopt positions is through, experimental validation.
Right.
Um, so, philosophers generally don't adopt positions, philosophical views on the basis of experimental validity. But they adopt frameworks that they kind of elaborate, refine, um, and use to pose questions that they're interested in, use to kind of carve up the world in a way that makes sense to them. Um, and I mean, I think that, I mean, it's like you said, I mean, it's easy to think of lots of philosophical frameworks that have been enormously fruitful in the sense that I described for science and mathematics.
So suppose, and I kind of am, suppose I said I was a solipsist, in which case only one of us is here. So that's definitely non-falsifiable.
Uh-huh.
And most scientists, or many scientists, including Feynman, would say, well, I don't have time to talk to you about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's not a scientific theory. I mean, it's not something that can be investigated. I understand why they might not be interested in that. I mean, I mean, that sort of goes to the whole point of the book, right? Which is that
Exactly.
what interests them is a problem they can solve.
Right.
Um, not a problem that's merely interesting isn't good enough for science, right? Because it doesn't matter how interesting it is, if you can't make progress on it, you're just going to leave it to the side and focus on something that you could potentially make progress on, right? A problem, a philosophical problem that just has no hope of resolution, um, through any convincing means is just not an attractive problem.
Right. Which is why many scientists make fun of scientists who believe
Yeah,
in string theory.
including Feynman.
Yeah. Right.
Uh,
Right. Exactly. But uh, so is it like, okay, so I just said that strings theory, there's a fight among scientists as to whether it has any validity, blah, blah, blah. Are there arguments against your position within your school of philosophy? Are there other philosophers who disagree with the positions you've taken?
um, I don't know that I'm important enough to disagree with. So, I mean, I think that the dominant view would be, and kind of the default view is that scientific theories are adopted uh, once the evidence for them is overwhelming. Um, but the history of science just doesn't bear that out. Philosophers of science tend not to be that interested in history, and so it's easy to maintain this ideal if you don't pay attention to what is going on in history. I mean, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, the Oxford Studies in Philosophy of Science is a good series. It has kind of a lot of visibility. So there's a chance, I mean, that it may get on the radar of someone. And that's if there's one thing philosophers like to do, it's disagree with each other. So if it does get on somebody's radar, I can guarantee that they will disagree with it.
That's great. So you're looking forward to someone trashing your book.
Yes, exactly. It's like my
Yeah.
dream.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree too. Well, so like in conclusion, then, because of your books and of your works, this book has a beautiful cover. And again, as a bookseller, people are going to buy it because of its cover. It's just,
Interesting. Okay, good to know.
well, so who did you vet it? How did the publisher decide? Did you have any input into it?
Yeah, they asked me if I had any ideas for an image, and I sent them that, and it was out of copyright, so they're like, let's do it. Yeah.
That's cool.
Um,
Most of the
yeah,
time,
I love the image.
yeah,
Like,
it's really beautiful and it really will work. And so, okay, yeah. So amongst your works, then, this is a book that's designed not to be uh, ordered to be bought by students in order to teach a course. This is a book that's supposed to be on my front table that a layperson can buy. And I think it is.
yeah.
So if that's the case, I guess in conclusion then, because it's hard for me to conclude because I just keep talking, but in conclusion then, what would you like the reader to take away from this? You wrote it for somebody like me, I think.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So what am I supposed to take away from it? I've taken away a lot of stuff, but rather than tell you, you tell me what you would like.
I guess I'd like them to take away a genuine and kind of more human-centered understanding of science, yeah, of the rationality of science, of the kind of power of scientific knowledge, than we're accustomed to getting in the course of, you know, everyday life, popular representations and so forth.
And it might actually get them interested in aspects of science that are their interest is piqued by because of the book too.
I would hope so. Yeah.
Yeah. The idea of, in my book, the way I look at books is once you can read a novel and you close it, it's wrapped up in a little nice package and cover it with wrapping paper and tied with a string, and that's the end of it. Or you can read a book, close the pages, and you're still thinking, I'm still listening to Rage Against the Machine, you know, because of your book. So I'm still going to be thinking about your book after I've completed the book. I think that's the best compliment I can give you. So
Oh, that's really gratifying. Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for reading it. I mean, gosh, yeah.
yeah, I don't think it's fair to an author not to read the book if you're going to be talking to the author about the book.
Well, okay.
And then I wouldn't know about, you know, just the part about drawing within the lines is a very fascinating topic. Just that'll, so yeah, it's well worth reading it for that kind of reason alone. So I would love to spend an hour with you just talking to you about things where you remember the intersection of the streets. I got plenty of.
Oh yeah, yeah, that'd be a great conversation.
I would have to think about that one. Okay, Chris, thanks so much. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you. Likewise. I really appreciate it. I hope to visit your bookstore someday.
I would love to have you there.
All right. Take care.
You too.